No one else will want you. That's what he said. And she remembered every word, not because she wanted to, but because once spoken, some things don't fade. They settle inside the bones, waiting in the quiet, echoing long after footsteps have gone. She had loved him, genuinely, quietly, in a way that asked for nothing but truth. But truth was the one thing he never gave her. In that moment, when those 7 words cut through her like broken glass, Mireille didn't cry. She didn't plead. She walked away, carrying more than just heartbreak. She carried a child. His child. Have you ever loved someone who made you feel like you weren't enough? Not because you lacked anything, but because their own fear made them cruel? Because they couldn't see you without seeing their own brokenness? Cassiel Lysander was brilliant, respected, admired. But none of that mattered when he looked her in the eyes and decided she was disposable. He built empires but couldn't build a safe place for her. She offered him something real, and he called it a complication. And yet, what happens when a man who broke everything tries to rebuild it? What if, after all the silence, he chooses to become someone different? Not to win her back, but to finally face what he once refused to feel? What if he changes? If you believe people can change and that redemption isn't just possible, but necessary, then like this video and subscribe. This story will move something in you. I promise. Before we continue, dear Lord, help us learn that silence can wound as deeply as cruelty. Give strength to the hearts that were once pushed aside, and peace to those who had to walk away to survive. Help us forgive, even when the hurt runs deep. Remind us that growth is possible, even for those who've caused pain. May those listening today carry these lessons with open hearts. Amen. He didn't yell when he said it. That's what made it worse. There was no rage, no shouting, no heated moment he could blame. Just a calm, polished man in a tailored suit, looking her in the eye and quietly gutting her with a sentence. No one else will want you. Not like this. Mireille stood there, frozen. Her hands clutched the sonogram photo, still warm from her coat pocket. She had practiced how to tell him, rehearsed the words, even imagined, for just a flicker of hope, that maybe his hardened face would soften. It didn't. He paced, talked about image, about timing, about plans, but not once about love, not once about her. It wasn't the rejection that broke her, it was the cold efficiency of it. Like she was a file being closed, a liability being removed. She left that night, not with rage, not with revenge, just a quiet, trembling breath, and the first step toward choosing peace over punishment. He never chased her, never called. But let me ask you something. Have you ever walked away from someone you loved, not because you stopped loving them, but because staying would have meant losing yourself? That's what Mireille did. She didn't disappear out of pride. She disappeared to survive. Back in Manhattan, Cassiel Lysander returned to his corner office and his mirrored high-rise views, to board meetings and acquisitions, to the world applauding him for his brilliance, unaware that the only person who had ever seen past his money, past his armor, was gone. And he let her go, not because she wasn't worth it, but because at that time, he wasn't. Yet life has a way of humbling even the untouchable. Years later, when the very empire he had built began to crack beneath his feet, it wasn't the collapse of wealth that haunted him. It was the absence of her laughter, the way her presence had quieted something in him he didn't know needed softening, and the fact that somewhere in this world was a child with eyes that might look like his. He never told anyone what he'd said to her that night. Not his assistant, not his closest advisor, not even himself, not out loud. But Mireille remembered, and the silence that followed wasn't just absence, it was a wall, a final confirmation that to him, her love was only valuable when it asked for nothing. So she went where love still meant something, a place with no boardrooms, no marble floors, no carefully rehearsed apologies. She went where she could begin again, where she could become a mother without shame. Her name faded from headlines, but it never left his thoughts. He tried to bury her memory under success. Deals, distractions, faces that smiled at his power but never touched his heart. And each night, as the city hummed beneath his penthouse, he would sit with a glass of something expensive and feel nothing. Because money can buy silence, but it cannot fill the space where someone once waited for you to choose them. So let me ask you again, what do you do when the one who shattered your heart shows up again? Not with flowers, not with a polished speech, but with changed hands, changed eyes, a changed soul. Would you open the door? Would you let them meet the child they once denied? Would you let them try? This story isn't about revenge. It's not about punishment. It's about the hard road to forgiveness, the kind that isn't pretty or instant, but real. So stay with me, because before healing, there was heartbreak. Before the home, there was a walk into the unknown. And before Cassiel Lysander found the courage to become the man Mireille deserved, he had to lose everything that made him feel untouchable. And if you're still here, it means something in this story speaks to you. So take a second, hit that like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to Mr. Ross Story Trail. These aren't just stories, they're reminders of who we've been, who we've hurt, and who we still have time to become. At the center of Manhattan, surrounded by streets that never slept and people who never slowed down, stood a tower made of glass and pride. Lysander Holdings didn't just occupy space on the skyline, it dominated it. It didn't whisper success, it declared it. The building was a mirror, reflecting the world it looked down on. Inside, the hallways stretched long and cold, the walls were thick with wealth, and the people walked fast, because slowing down meant slipping behind. At the top of it all sat Cassiel Lysander. He was a man whose name could move markets. One email from him could raise or collapse a company's stock price by noon. He wore power like a second skin, flawless, pressed and sharp around the edges. People spoke of him with admiration and caution. He was a man that others bowed to, even when he wasn't in the room. But beneath the power, beneath the layers of luxury and authority, Cassiel lived in a silence of his own making. Not the kind that brought peace, but the kind that echoed. He had everything the world said mattered: multiple properties, rare art, a car collection that hadn't touched pavement in months, and yet nothing held meaning past the moment it was acquired. It was always on to the next. He arrived each morning to an office where no one dared interrupt unless scheduled. His name on the elevator carried weight, but not warmth. He was surrounded by people, yet untouched by connection, and that was by design. Because connection to Cassiel meant risk. Behind closed doors, his past lived like a ghost in tailored silence. He never spoke of his father, who once made promises louder than his fists, or his mother, who sat through the storm with her hands folded, pretending nothing was wrong. He had learned early that love came with fine print. That trust was just a loan with interest. So he built walls, beautiful, high, impenetrable walls, and the world rewarded him for it. The higher he climbed, the less human he became. Meanwhile, not far from the noise and money, lived a woman who measured her days by stories and kindness. Mireille didn't own a skyscraper. She didn't want one. She ran a bookstore tucked between a laundromat and an old cafe with chipped mugs and loyal customers. Her shop, Whisper and Quill, smelled like paper and lemon tea. It was small, warm, and always full of light. Mireille greeted everyone by name, remembered birthdays, tucked handwritten notes inside second-hand novels just to make strangers smile. Children loved her because she listened. Elders trusted her because she never rushed. She didn't have much, but she had meaning. While Cassiel rose each morning to a city built on transactions, Mireille opened her store, with a key attached to a ribbon, humming softly as she turned the sign to open. While he skimmed contracts over black coffee he never finished, she poured chamomile. For a widowed professor who came in every Thursday just to feel remembered. Their worlds didn't touch. They had no reason to, until the one day everything shifted. Cassiel's life was engineered for control. Everything in his world was timed, tracked, and calculated. His schedule was airtight. His meals arrived on time, low sodium and high efficiency. He had assistants for errands he never acknowledged, and a driver whose name he never learned. His penthouse overlooked the city like a throne, and yet he often stood at the window not in triumph, but in stillness, because for all his acquisitions, Cassiel Lysander hadn't truly touched anything in years. He gave orders but never held hands. He signed deals but never offered comfort. He didn't feel proud. He felt suspended. There were nights he sat alone at his marble dining table, untouched dinner going cold, thinking of nothing in particular. Not because there was peace, but because there was nothing left to fight for that he hadn't already claimed. Some men lose their souls chasing power. Cassiel traded his long ago, and the world called it discipline. One floor below his office was a private lounge, off limits to all but his most trusted circle. Dark wood panels, custom whiskey, no music, just silence, and the occasional sound of ice clinking in a glass. It was in that room once that a partner joked, "You've got everything a man could want, Cassiel." He didn't answer, because even he knew it wasn't true. Mireille, by contrast, lived a life built not on silence, but quiet, the kind of quiet that welcomes thought instead of avoiding it. She wore cardigans with frayed sleeves, mismatched earrings she found at antique stores, and shoes that had walked through more chapters than some novels. Her hair was rarely styled, her hands often ink-stained from writing small notes on bookmarks. She believed people were worth knowing, that memories mattered more than metrics. She didn't make six figures, but her life was full. Every Thursday she closed the shop early to read at the local community center. Children gathered around her like she was a campfire. She didn't just read books, she performed them. She gave every character a voice, every pause meaning, and when they asked, "Is this a true story?" she always said, "Every story is true to someone." Cassiel had never stepped foot inside her bookstore. He had never needed to, but fate does not ask permission. It does not check bank accounts or appointment logs. It moves in silence, not strategy. And sometimes it takes two people from different corners of the same city, people with no reason to meet, and collides them in a way neither sees coming. Not because they're meant to save each other, but because they're meant to learn. One lived above the clouds, surrounded by noise and success, but untouched by love. The other lived beneath the radar, surrounded by stories, but untouched by cruelty. And yet, fate doesn't care about social classes. It only cares about lessons. The room was too bright. Golden fixtures spilled light across white floors, glass walls, and gowns that shimmered like currency. Waiters drifted by like moving sculptures, balancing trays of imported delicacies, and drinks named after places most guests had never visited, yet claimed to know. A string quartet played something expensive. The conversations were curated, polished smiles paired with compliments that meant little. Attendees nodded on cue, laughed with restraint, and clinked glasses over causes they rarely remembered once they left. Everything felt arranged. This was Cassiel Lysander's world. He didn't want to be there. He stood near the far wall, flanked by two board members still discussing numbers beneath their breath, even while holding wine flutes. Cassiel said little. He was the kind of presence that didn't need to speak to command attention. Someone across the room snapped a photo. Flash. He blinked once and turned away. 10 minutes past the hour, the back doors opened. It wasn't the entrance people noticed. It was the disruption. Shoes squeaked faintly on polished floors. A trail of water dotted the tile, and at the center of it was a young woman, hair damp, sleeves rolled, cheeks flushed from the wind. She wasn't in heels. She didn't carry a clutch or smile like she'd rehearsed. Instead, she held a stack of books to her chest like they were sacred. Old books, some wrapped in cloth, others worn along the edges. Their spines whispered stories, not status. She didn't rush. She moved with quiet purpose, scanning the room for the donation table, unaware that every head she passed turned slightly, not in admiration but confusion. She didn't belong. And yet, she didn't flinch. Cassiel noticed her the way one notices an unexpected sound in a perfectly timed orchestra. Not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't. There was a ripple in the air the moment she entered. Not loud, not disruptive, just real. She approached a display near a sculpture Cassiel had donated years ago. A piece someone once told him symbolized timeless transformation. He never asked what that meant. As she leaned over the table to arrange her books, a drop of water slid from her elbow and landed on the base of the sculpture. Cassiel's voice cut through the space. "You're dripping on a $500,000 statue." She looked up, unfazed. Her gaze met his. Direct, calm. "It'll dry," she said. "Stone usually does." A pause. A flicker of something unfamiliar passed through Cassiel's eyes. Was it irritation? No, it was interest. People didn't speak to him like that. Not here. Not ever. Cassiel didn't respond right away. Most people would have stumbled, apologized, laughed nervously, attempted charm. She didn't. She went back to her task, gently adjusting the corner of a book like it deserved a moment of attention. He found himself standing still, watching, not the way he watched reports or competition. This was different. There was no performance in her, no curated persona, just a woman with rain-dampened shoes, handling first editions like they were friends. After a few seconds, he walked over. He didn't know why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was the sheer fact that her presence had thrown something off balance in a room that rarely surprised him. "Those don't exactly match the setting," he said, nodding to the books. She looked up again. "Maybe the setting doesn't matter." Her tone wasn't confrontational. It was honest. She straightened one of the older covers. These were donated for auction. Hemingway, Morrison, a rare Angelou print. Cassiel raised an eyebrow. "You know your titles." "I know my friends," she said, patting the book gently. "Stories don't survive unless someone cares enough to carry them." There was a pause, one of those long, unspoken moments where two people exist in a space without noise but with weight. Cassiel studied her face. Not for beauty, though it was there, but for clarity. She didn't want anything from him. She didn't recognize him, or if she did, she didn't care. That unnerved him more than he expected. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated for just a breath. "Mireille." He repeated it quietly, like a word he wasn't used to saying. "And you are?" she asked, not with curiosity, but with politeness. The kind people offer when they don't expect the answer to matter. Cassiel. Nothing in her expression shifted. That too was new. They stood there for a beat longer. Then she turned back to the table. "If you'll excuse me, I need to make sure no one stacks wine glasses near the Tolstoy." She walked away without waiting for permission. Cassiel remained still. He didn't like events. Never had. But now, he didn't want to leave. The rest of the evening blurred. He took calls, nodded through handshakes, smiled when it was required. But in his mind, he kept circling back to her, to the calm in her voice, to the gentle way she placed each book like it had a soul, to the fact that she had made him feel something, and not because she tried to, but because she didn't. Outside, the city blinked with lights. Inside, Cassiel stood by a window, alone. And for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about deals, deadlines, or damage control. He was thinking about Mireille, and he didn't know why. Have you ever met someone who disarmed you with just their truth? Someone who didn't flatter, didn't fear you, just saw you plainly? Drop a comment and tell us. We'd love to hear your story. He returned the following Thursday. No appointment, no security detail, no driver waiting at the curb. Just Cassiel Lysander in a navy coat that cost more than the store's monthly rent, standing outside. Whisper and Quill with a paperback in his hand and something he couldn't name in his chest. Mireille looked up when the bell above the door chimed. Her face didn't light up. She didn't rush to greet him. She just offered a small nod, as if he were any other customer. Cassiel walked to the counter, held up the book. "I believe this is yours." She glanced at the cover. "I think it's yours now." He set it down gently. "I didn't finish it." "You didn't try," she replied, sorting receipts. "I might. Then you'll need it a little longer." She didn't ask why he came back. He didn't explain. He left without buying anything. But the next week, he came again. It became a rhythm. Every Thursday, sometime between noon and 2, Cassiel walked in. Sometimes he sat. Sometimes he browsed. Once, he even brought a coffee. Black, no sugar. He never drank it. He didn't speak much, just watched. Watched Mireille guide an elderly man through the biography section, helping him find a book he hadn't seen since childhood. Watched her kneel beside a young boy with autism, tracing the illustrations in a picture book and letting him lead the pace. Watched her tape the spine of an old poetry collection like it was something sacred, not damaged. She was nothing like the world he knew. There were no hidden agendas in her kindness. She didn't smile to please. She smiled because she meant it. He once caught himself watching her for almost 20 minutes without realizing he hadn't looked at his phone. That scared him more than he admitted. Some weeks she said hello. Some weeks she didn't. She treated him like a regular customer. But slowly, she made space for him. A chair in the back, near the window. A small coaster for the coffee he never drank. A single question, once. "Do you ever read for pleasure?" He had no answer. He began picking up books he'd never considered. Fiction, memoirs, children's classics. He didn't know why. At night, he read pages without checking the time. His world, once ruled by strategy, began to shift. Not in grand ways. In quiet ones. One afternoon, He noticed a boy crying near the front. Mireille crouched beside him, not asking what was wrong, just sitting near. After a minute, she whispered, "Want to tell me what page you're stuck on?" The boy sniffled, then nodded. She didn't rush him. She didn't correct him. She read each sentence with him, pausing only to let him sound out the hard words. Cassiel stood in the aisle, holding a book he hadn't opened. His throat tightened, and he didn't know why. Later, as she restocked a shelf, he walked over. "You're good with people," he said. She shrugged. "Books teach you how to listen." He paused. "And what have they taught you about me?" She smiled faintly. "You're here." That's enough. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. It was the 10th Thursday when he asked to help close the shop. She blinked, surprised. "You don't seem like the shelving type." "I'm trying new things," he said, removing his coat. "Starting small." She handed him a stack of hardcovers. He shelved them with all the grace of a man used to delegating rather than doing. One landed upside down, another in the wrong section. She corrected them with a soft laugh. "You're terrible at this. I was afraid of that." But she didn't tell him to stop. There were no declarations, no exchanged phone numbers, no promises of lunch, no veiled flirting. But slowly, things shifted. Cassiel began arriving a little earlier, staying a little longer. Once he caught Mireille humming as she stocked the poetry shelf. The sound stayed with him for days. Another afternoon, she passed him a book of essays on grief. "I think you'd find something in this." He didn't ask why. He read it in one sitting. Cassiel started to notice the space differently. The bookstore had no grandeur, but it had grace. Fairy lights hung above the front desk, uneven, some flickering, others warm and steady. A photograph of a young girl and her dog sat near the register, slightly tilted in a frame. He never asked who she was. It felt personal, like something sacred. Customers lingered here longer than necessary. Even after buying something, they'd stand near the door, as if saying goodbye too quickly would disrupt something gentle. Cassiel often caught himself studying Mireille when she wasn't looking. She moved like someone who knew the value of slowness. There was rhythm in the way she handled books, as if they were living things. She never rushed, never barked orders, never filled silence with noise. The longer he stayed, the more he realized how much of his life had been spent in a rush to nowhere. One evening, the store remained open later than usual. A storm had delayed a delivery, and she was behind on restocking. Cassiel stayed, stacking new titles beside her in the quiet. Outside, the streets dimmed. Inside, the fairy lights gave off their soft glow. "Do you ever miss the noise?" he asked suddenly. Mireille looked up. "What noise?" "The kind that fills up the empty parts." She tilted her head. "Sometimes, but not enough to invite it back." He nodded slowly. They finished shelving in silence. He walked her to the door, where she paused to lock up. The bell above the door gave its usual soft ring. Cassiel turned to her, not urgently, not with any agenda, just, still. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she asked. "For not asking me to be anyone." She didn't answer right away. Then she reached up, adjusting one of the lights that had dimmed slightly. When she looked back at him, something had shifted, not between them, within them. She stepped forward, not out of impulse, but out of trust. He leaned down, not because he was sure, but because he hoped. Their lips met in the hush between words. It wasn't fiery. It wasn't desperate. It was tender. Measured, an unspoken agreement between two people who had spent too long pretending they didn't need anything. When they parted, there were no wide eyes, no gasps, just breath. Steady, close. Mireille looked up at him. "You're not who I expected," she whispered. He touched her cheek gently. "Neither are you." The lights above them flickered once, then settled, and somewhere, in the quiet, something began. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. Sometimes a kiss isn't the beginning of passion. It's the beginning of change. Snow had begun to settle against the bookstore windows. It was one of those quiet evenings where time felt suspended. Mireille had just closed early. The street outside was hushed, and the shelves behind her cast long shadows from the string lights overhead. Cassiel sat at the corner table with a book open on his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in 15 minutes. He wasn't reading. He was watching her again, the way she moved, the way she cleaned up with care rather than urgency. She turned the sign on the door to closed and walked toward him slowly. There was a folded envelope in her hand, slightly creased from how tightly she'd been holding it. "I need to show you something," she said. Cassiel straightened, his eyes drifting to her hands. She didn't speak. Instead, she opened the envelope and pulled out a photo, soft gray and black, grainy yet unmistakable. A sonogram. She placed it in front of him, then stepped back like the distance might cushion the response. For a moment, Cassiel said nothing. He stared at the image, then at her, then back again. A silence took hold, thicker than any that had passed between them. "How far along?" he asked, voice steady. 13 weeks. Still, he didn't move. She tucked her arms around her waist. "I found out 3 weeks ago. I wanted to be sure before I told you." He leaned back slowly, jaw tense. "I didn't expect this," he said at last. "I didn't either." Cassiel looked down again, brows low. The pause grew heavier. Mireille stepped forward. "I know this changes things, but I wanted you to know. I'm not asking for anything. This isn't part of the plan," he said flatly, cutting her off. Her breath caught. "What?" He stood, not quickly, but with purpose. "You don't understand, Mireille. My life isn't flexible. It's built on structure, decisions, control." She stared at him, stunned. "This isn't a meeting, Cassiel. It's a child." "I'm aware," he replied, too calmly. "And I'm telling you, this complicates everything." Something inside her cracked. "You don't get to reduce this to inconvenience," she said, voice shaking. "You were there. You held me. You stayed. Don't act like you were sleepwalking." Cassiel turned away from her, pacing a slow, deliberate path. "You don't know what people will say, what this would do to my name, to my position." She blinked. "Is that what I am now? A risk?" He didn't answer. "Say it," she dared him. "Say what you're really thinking." He turned back to her, his face unreadable. "No one else will want you, Mireille. Not carrying my child." Her world went still. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look cruel. But his words landed like steel. And this time she didn't respond. Not with anger, not with pleading. She picked up the sonogram, folded it back into the envelope, put on her coat. He didn't stop her. She opened the door. Cold air swept in. She looked back once. There was no trace of the man who once sat beside her reading children's books in quiet joy. Only a stranger in expensive clothing, afraid of what love had cost him. She stepped out, and the door closed behind her. Mireille didn't go home. She didn't pack everything, didn't slam drawers, didn't cry into pillows or rage at the walls. She took what she needed, documents, some clothes, a few first editions from the shop's back shelf, and left the city while the streets were still covered in snow. No farewell letters, no final message, just silence. The next morning, Cassiel arrived at Whisper and Quill like he always did. Out of habit, or guilt, he wasn't sure. The sign was gone. The window display was empty. Inside, dust had already begun to settle. He called her phone, disconnected, checked her apartment, cleared out. She had vanished without a trace. He told himself it was better this way. He told himself she'd be safer, that the distance was logical, clean. But for the first time in years, logic didn't bring comfort. He sat in the back of the bookstore alone that evening, long after the landlord had locked the doors. His breath clouded in the cold, and still he didn't move. The sonogram image haunted him. He saw it in the corners of his mind, floating just beneath his closed eyelids. A shape forming, a life beginning, a choice he didn't make. Weeks passed, then months. He never spoke about her to anyone. In meetings, his focus remained. In headlines, his presence grew. His company reached new heights. On paper, he was thriving. But alone, he sat in silence. Often, long after the lights went out, he stopped attending events, stopped hosting private gatherings, stopped smiling for photos. And still, no one noticed. No one asked about the bookstore girl, because no one had seen her the way he had. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you loved for your own peace? Not because you stopped loving them, but because they refused to choose you. Because staying would have meant abandoning yourself. If you've ever been there, click share. This story isn't just fiction, it's someone's truth. One night, a courier delivered a package to Cassiel's office. Inside was a first edition copy of The Little Prince. No note, just the book. When he opened it, he found something pressed between the pages, a small pressed flower and a bookmark with a handwritten quote. "What is essential is invisible to the eye." It wasn't her handwriting, but it didn't have to be. He stared at it for a long time, then closed the book slowly and held it to his chest. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of everything he had chosen not to carry. And it was heavier than he expected. The town was small, the kind people don't write headlines about. Its streets were slow, its voices familiar. There were no towers scraping the clouds, no sirens echoing off concrete, no flashes of cameras outside glass-walled boardrooms. Just wind through pine trees, salt in the air, and a steady rhythm of quiet. Mireille found it by accident, though part of her believed it found her. She settled in a cottage not far from the coastline, a place where fog kissed. The windows in the morning and gulls announced the day like clockwork. It was enough. It wasn't wealth. It was peace. Esme was born in early autumn. She arrived with a head full of wild curls and a pair of hazel eyes that looked like they belonged to someone else, a man Mireille hadn't spoken to since winter. The delivery room was silent except for the newborn's cries. Mireille held her close, whispered her name, and promised her two things: that she would always be safe, and that she would never feel like she had to earn love. Mireille didn't miss the city, not once. She began work at the local library a few weeks after Esme's birth. The hours were light, the building small. Every corner smelled like dust and old pages. There was a chair in the back that faced the window, and that became her favorite spot for story time. Esme often sat in her lap, giggling at animal voices and pointing out colors. The town grew to love them quickly. There was no gossip, no questions about where they came from. Just baked goods at their doorstep, borrowed coats on cold mornings, and neighbors who waved even when they didn't need anything. Esme grew fast. She had a laugh that filled the room, and a habit of making up stories during dinner, weaving princesses with dragons and librarians who could fly. She didn't ask about her father, not for years. And when she did, Mireille answered gently. He was someone I loved, and someone I had to leave. Esme only nodded. She was too young to carry the weight. Mireille intended to keep it that way. Back in Manhattan, Cassiel tried to move on. He told himself she would return. She didn't. He hired people, quietly, to search. No formal investigation, no alerts, just whispers through the right hands. Nothing came back. No trace, no receipts, no trail. She had erased herself completely. And for the first time in his life, Cassiel Lysander couldn't fix something. He couldn't control it, couldn't reverse it. He had lost her, and there was no spreadsheet to correct that. Cassiel stopped attending public events. He turned down interviews, rejected speaking engagements, and let others stand in for photo ops. His face slowly disappeared from the covers of business magazines, but his name still echoed through boardrooms. He was present, but hollow. He moved through days on schedule, still sharp in meetings, still precise with numbers. But when evening came, the silence of his apartment felt unbearable. No voices, no questions, no warmth. Just the sound of his own breath and the constant hum of something missing. The more he tried to distract himself, the more the absence became obvious. He bought new art. It didn't move him. Upgraded his home's interior. Still empty. Tried dating. Twice. Both times he ended dinners early with excuses about work. He couldn't focus. Their laughter felt foreign. Their questions felt rehearsed. No one saw him the way she had. Not for status, not for power, but for something he barely recognized in himself. He began waking in the middle of the night. No noise, no alarm, just a heavy weight in his chest and a need to stand by the window hands. In his pockets, eyes scanning the skyline like it might offer answers. Sometimes he found himself wondering what she was reading. If she still smiled at the sound of paper turning. If her child, their child, had learned to laugh the way she used to. One night, in that fragile space between sleep and waking, he saw her, not as a memory, not as a passing thought, but as clear as if she had never left. She stood behind the bookstore counter, her sleeves rolled up, her hair tucked loosely behind one ear. There was dust in the air, and a record playing low in the background, something soft, familiar. He stepped forward. She didn't look up. Books lay open across the desk. A paper crane sat folded beside a teacup. "Do you need help with something?" she asked, her voice exactly as he remembered. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached out, touched the side of her face. Warm, real. She looked at him then, her eyes searching. Not angry, not hurt, just quiet. "I never meant to disappear," he whispered. "I know. I thought I had more time. You had exactly what you needed. You just didn't choose it." She stepped back. The room grew dim. The lights flickered. He reached for her again, but this time she faded before he could make contact. Gone. Cassiel woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, throat dry. He sat up in bed and stared into the dark. There was no one beside him. There never had been. The next morning, he canceled his meetings. He stayed home. For hours, he stood in front of the small bookshelf in his office, one that had once held awards and quarterly reports. Now, it held the same first edition she had once gifted him. A quiet novel with a pressed flower still tucked between the pages. He hadn't touched it since the day she left. He opened it slowly. The flower was brittle now, but intact. He ran his thumb over the stem, and this time he didn't close the book. He sat down, and he read. It started with a headline: "Whistleblower accuses Lysander Holdings of ethics breach." Cassiel read it in the back of his car, eyes unmoving as the city passed by. The morning rush outside was its usual blur, but something inside him had slowed. He didn't flinch. He didn't panic, but something tightened in his chest. By noon, the phones wouldn't stop ringing. A junior executive, someone Cassiel barely remembered hiring, had leaked documents, internal emails, financial reports, files not meant for the public. By 2 p.m., legal was on the line. By 3 p.m., 4 major partners had requested meetings. Cassiel remained calm. Too calm. He asked questions, took notes, gave commands, but inside, something felt loose. He had faced pressure before, but this wasn't pressure. This was erosion. At first, he treated it like damage control. He scheduled interviews, fired the whistleblower, reassigned blame, but the cracks kept spreading. A partner in Hong Kong suddenly pulled funding. An investor in London backed out of a major merger. A longtime board member stopped answering his calls. In less than 6 weeks, Cassiel lost nearly 1/3 of his financial stability. His name was still powerful, but power had become unstable. And when a man builds his worth on control, losing control feels like losing air. He barely slept. Meetings bled into meals, which bled into silence. He no longer stood at his window to admire the city. Now he stood there trying to remember how things had gotten so far away. One night, he stared at a financial report with numbers he could no longer fix. He thought of Mireille. He thought of the bookstore, the quiet, the steadiness of her presence, the way she didn't care what he owned, only how he listened. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out the sonogram photo he'd once nearly thrown away. It was worn now, faded. He didn't know why he still kept it. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the only thing that ever felt honest. His assistant entered the room with a tight expression. "There's a package for you. No return address." Cassiel didn't look up. Who sent it? No name. Just this. She placed the envelope on his desk and left. He stared at it for a long moment. It wasn't the size that struck him. It was the handwriting. Childlike. Large, uneven letters on the front. No stamp. No company logo. Just 3 words. For Mr. Cassiel. Cassiel sat for a long time before touching the envelope. His name, written in rounded, slightly shaky letters, looked foreign on paper, like a memory from a life he'd never lived. He slid a letter opener under the seal. Inside wasn't a document. It was a folded piece of paper, crayon on printer stock, a child's drawing, 3 stick figures, one tall figure in a dark suit with square shoulders and long legs, one woman beside him with brown hair and a book in her hand, and between them, a small girl, wild curls drawn in looping orange strokes, smiling, holding both their hands. Above them, a building with a heart in the window. Below them, a caption, written in different colors. "Mommy says you used to be sad. I hope you're not anymore." Cassiel couldn't breathe. The paper trembled in his hands. The drawing wasn't perfect, but it was clear. The woman was Mireille. The girl, their daughter, a child he had never met. He stood abruptly, pacing, gripping the edges of the drawing like it might fly away if he let go. This wasn't press. This wasn't scandal. This was personal, real, undeniable. He sat back down, staring at the message again. A child, his child, had drawn him not as a businessman, not as a name on a building, but as something far more terrifying. A father. He whispered the caption aloud. "Mommy says you used to be sad." His voice broke. He placed the drawing on his desk carefully, as if afraid to damage it. Then he opened the envelope again. One more slip of paper had been tucked behind the drawing. A receipt, dated 3 years prior, from a small bookstore in Oregon. One of the books listed, A Wrinkle in Time. His breath caught. That was hers. He knew it. She had mentioned once how it shaped her as a girl, how she reread it every year. He hadn't understood why then. Now he did. He stood slowly. For the first time in months, he felt awake. Not resolved, not whole, but awake. Cassiel didn't call his assistant, didn't schedule anything, didn't inform the board. He just packed a bag, left the drawing on his desk, and walked out. Cassiel didn't take a private jet. He flew commercial. Coach, no suit, no entourage, no watch ticking deadlines into his wrist, just jeans, a plain coat, and a duffel bag with nothing but the basics. He looked like anyone else waiting at the terminal, tired, quiet, alone. And for the first time in years, he liked it that way. Oregon welcomed him with gray skies and air that smelled clean. The pace here was different. People walked slower, spoke softer. They made eye contact without calculation. He rented a car. No driver, no GPS. Just an address scribbled in his notebook from the old receipt, connected to a tiny bookshop on the edge of a coastal town. It wasn't Whisper and Quill, but it held the same heartbeat. The woman behind the counter was kind-eyed, maybe in her 60s. She didn't recognize him. "Looking for something in particular?" she asked. Cassiel hesitated. "A woman named Mireille. She may have worked here. 3 years ago." The woman squinted, then smiled. "Oh, you mean the library girl. She runs the story program now. Moved up the hill after Esme was born. Sweet child, that one." Cassiel's breath caught at the sound of her name. Esme. The library sat nestled between a small park and a church with a weathered bell tower. Ivy crept up one wall and paper decorations fluttered in the windows. He didn't go in, not yet. Instead, he sat in his car for over an hour, watching children walk in and out with storybooks and paper crowns. A group of toddlers passed by, laughing as they held hands. Then he saw her, Mireille, standing on the steps, waving goodbye to a mother with 2 children. Her hair was longer now, pulled back in a loose braid. She wore a soft blue sweater and flat shoes. Her hands still moved gently, like they remembered every book they'd ever held. And beside her, a little girl, tight curls, hazel eyes. Esme. Cassiel's heart thudded, not sharply but with weight. This was not a boardroom, not a contract. This was real. He returned the next day. Still didn't speak, just watched from a distance. He saw them walk to the grocery store, saw Esme skip over sidewalk cracks, saw Mireille pick up apples one by one, checking each before placing them in a cloth bag. He followed from far enough not to disturb. He didn't know what to say. He only knew that something in him had changed. On the 3rd day, Esme noticed him. She didn't point. She didn't run. She just stared, bright, steady eyes, and smiled. It was simple, innocent. Cassiel froze. That smile held no accusation, only curiosity, and something else, recognition. Mireille turned at the same moment. Their eyes met. She didn't smile, didn't frown. Her face went still, her hand tightening slightly around Esme's. She whispered something to the girl, then walked toward him. She stopped just a few feet away. Cassiel stood still, not reaching, not speaking. She studied him, head to toe, looking not for change in clothing or appearance, but in posture, in eyes, in weight. Finally, her voice came, calm and steady. "I didn't think you'd come." He nodded once. "I didn't think you'd still be here." Esme clung gently to her mother's side. "Mama, who is that man?" Mireille's voice caught slightly. "Someone I used to know." Esme tilted her head. He looked sad. Mireille gave a small, tight smile. He used to be. Cassiel crouched to Esme's level. "Hi," he said softly. "My name is Cassiel." The girl looked at him without fear. "You look like the drawing I made," she said. His breath hitched. "You sent it?" She nodded proudly. "Mommy didn't want me to. But I think people need letters when they're alone." Mireille looked down at her, then away. Cassiel swallowed hard. "Thank you. That letter, it reached me." Esme reached out and touched his coat sleeve. "I like your voice. You sound like the man in Mommy's stories." Mireille's eyes flickered. "She reads you stories?" he asked. "Only the good ones," Esme said, twirling slightly. He looked at Mireille. She met his gaze but said nothing. They walked slowly to the nearby park, Esme running ahead toward a set of swings. Cassiel and Mireille sat on a bench beneath a bare tree. No small talk, no pleasantries. Just air. He spoke first. "I was wrong." Mireille looked forward, not at him. "I know. I wasn't ready to be that person. Not for you, not for her." Her jaw tightened. "You didn't need to be perfect. You just needed to care." "I did," he said. "But I didn't know how to show it without control. I didn't know how to let things matter without trying to manage them. And now," he exhaled, "now I'm just trying to show up, with nothing to offer but myself." She turned to him, finally. "It took you long enough." They sat in silence again, this time less sharp. He glanced toward Esme. "She's everything." "She is," Mireille replied, softer now. "She looks like you. She laughs like you." His shoulders dropped. "That's hard to hear." "It should be." Esme called to them from the swing. "Push me, please." Cassiel stood, hesitated. Mireille gave a small nod. He walked to her, placed his hands gently on the swing's ropes, and gave her a soft push. Esme laughed, not out of delight at the speed, but at the attention, the closeness, the presence. Cassiel smiled. For the first time in a long while, it reached his eyes. That evening, before they parted, Mireille said one last thing. "I don't know what this is, or what it will be, but she deserves to know you, if you're willing to earn it." Cassiel nodded, eyes glassy. "I am. If you've ever been given a second chance or hope to have one, subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us we all deserve growth. Sometimes we're not ready the first time, but if we're lucky, we get to try again." Cassiel didn't come back with flowers or apologies dressed in charm. He came back with a suitcase and a 1-month lease at a modest guest house behind the bakery. The room was small, no city view, no concierge, just a creaky bed, a chipped mirror, and a kettle that hissed louder than it boiled. He didn't mind. He hadn't come for comfort. Each morning, he walked the main street of the town with quiet purpose. He didn't announce his presence, didn't try to explain who he was or who he used to be. He volunteered to help repaint the community center, carried tables for the weekend book fair, donated 3 good jackets to the winter clothing drive. When people asked what he did before, he simply said, "Business," and that was enough. At first, Mireille kept her distance. She watched from the library window as he raked leaves outside the preschool. She saw him stop to let an elderly man cross the street, waiting patiently even as cars honked behind him. She noticed how he never missed Esme's story hour, never asked to speak. Esme, however, welcomed him with full force. She invited him to her classroom art show, where he admired her finger paintings like they were masterpieces. She asked him to help name the teddy bear she'd gotten from the local thrift shop. He suggested marble after the stone statue he once owned. She liked it. He never corrected her. Cassiel tried cooking for the first time. He nearly set off the fire alarm making scrambled eggs. His toast came out black the first 3 tries. He called Mireille one night and asked her if pancakes could be made with olive oil. She laughed, quietly but genuinely. "No, please don't." One afternoon, he helped set up chairs for a children's reading event at the library. He wasn't scheduled. He just showed up. As he moved a crate of books, something fell out, an old hardcover of the Velveteen Rabbit. He paused, stared at it, and without thinking, opened the front cover. Inside was a dedication written in blue ink, from Mireille to a former library donor. But what struck him wasn't the writing. It was the final line of the book, underlined. "Once you are real, you can't become unreal again. It lasts for always." Cassiel sat down between the shelves, book in hand, and quietly pressed his forehead to the page. He didn't cry, but he closed his eyes long enough to mean it. He thought no one had seen, but Mireille had. From the end of the aisle, holding a stack of returns, she had paused, watching him, unreadable. She didn't say a word, just turned and walked away. But something inside her shifted. It wasn't pity, it wasn't forgiveness, it was recognition of a man unlearning everything he thought made him worthy. The town began to notice him, not in the way people notice celebrities or outsiders. They noticed that he held doors open, that he returned library books on time, that he picked up litter in the park without being asked. They noticed that Esme waved to him every time she saw him, and that he always waved back, even if he was across the street. One Saturday morning, Mireille arrived early to unlock the library. The sky was still pale, the windows fogged slightly with the chill. She was surprised to find the front door already open. Inside, Cassiel was crouched in the children's section, his coat folded beside him, Esme's drawing book in one hand, a small child pressed to his chest. The boy was no older than 5. His cheeks were red and blotchy. Tears clung to his lashes. Cassiel was whispering softly, not trying to stop the crying, just sitting with it. "I used to get scared when things felt too big," he said gently. "It's okay to cry. That means you're brave enough to feel." The boy hiccuped, then leaned his head against Cassiel's shoulder. Cassiel didn't flinch. He held him, patient, steady. Mireille stood at the doorway, silent. She'd seen powerful men. She'd seen practiced empathy, performative kindness. This wasn't that. There was no one around, no cameras, no gain. Just a man who had once broken something, now trying to hold small things with care. Later that day, she handed him a mug of warm tea. He looked surprised. "I figured you were tired of takeout coffee," she said. He took the cup without a word. Their fingers brushed. This time, she didn't pull away. A week passed, then another. The town no longer looked at him like a guest. Parents started saying hello at school pickups. A local mechanic offered to check the brakes on his rental without charging. Esme's teacher invited him to help build the class garden. He said yes, not because it was expected, because it felt right. One evening, after the library closed, Mireille found him restocking books. He wasn't humming. He wasn't speaking. Just placing books back where they belonged. She stood behind him, arms crossed, watching. "You don't have to keep showing up," she said softly. He turned. "I know." She paused. "But I'm glad you do." They walked home together that night. Esme ran ahead with her backpack bouncing behind her, chasing fireflies. Cassiel and Mireille trailed quietly behind. No labels, no promises, just steps, side by side. He didn't ask for forgiveness, and she didn't offer it. But there, under a dim streetlight, something passed between them. Not resolution, but readiness. The first snow came softly. It drifted down in slow, silent flakes, coating the rooftops, blanketing the trees, dusting the porch steps of a small home at the edge of town. Inside, Esme danced around the living room with socks sliding on hardwood floors. Her cheeks were flushed with joy. Cassiel watched from the couch, smiling over the edge of a worn storybook they'd just finished reading together. Mireille came in from the kitchen with 2 mugs of hot cocoa, one for her, one for Cassiel. He took his without speaking. The steam rose between them, thin and fleeting. Outside, the snow kept falling. Cassiel didn't live in the guest house anymore. He hadn't moved into their home either. Instead, he rented a small place down the road, close enough to walk Esme to school, far enough to respect Mireille's space. He never pushed. He just remained. Esme had started drawing 3 figures more frequently now, always with a son in the corner, always with them holding hands. Sometimes she'd label them. Me, Mama, Cass. She didn't call him Dad. Not yet. But the picture said what words hadn't caught up to. One evening, Esme stood at the window, watching the snow collect on the railing. She turned to Cassiel and said, "This is the first snow I remember." He crouched beside her. "It's beautiful." She nodded. "Mom says snow is quiet because it listens." Cassiel blinked. "She said that?" Esme grinned. "She says a lot of smart things." He smiled, eyes misting. "I know." That night, after Esme was tucked into bed, Mireille stepped out onto the porch. Cassiel followed, pulling his coat tighter against the chill. The world outside was still, the kind of stillness that feels earned. They stood side by side, watching the snow cover the world in softness. Cassiel broke the silence. She saved me. Mireille looked over at him. You both did. His voice was steady but quiet. I didn't know what love looked like. Not until I saw her laugh. Not until I saw you give so much without needing anything back. Mireille's breath showed in the cold. You used to think love was weakness. I did, he admitted. But it's the only thing that ever held me together. She turned to face him. Her eyes were clear, not cold, not angry, but firm. You once told me no one would want me. Cassiel closed his eyes. I know. He opened them again, looked directly at her. I was scared, and when I'm scared, I say things to push people away. And you did. I did. Cassiel didn't rush to explain himself. He let the weight of his old words hang in the air, not because he wanted pity, but because he finally understood their cost. Mireille looked at him for a long time. Then she said softly but clearly, You once told me no one else would want me. He nodded. She stepped a little closer. But I never stopped wanting you. Not the version that left, the one standing here now. Her voice was calm, the one who stayed. He didn't know how to respond. So she helped him. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold. His were shaking. Still, they held on. A quiet passed between them, not the kind that separates people, but the kind that gently binds. Then she leaned forward. He did too, and when their lips met, it wasn't the same as the first time in the bookstore. This one wasn't asking permission. It wasn't uncertain. It was an answer. One earned, not given. Inside, Esme had fallen asleep on the couch, the remains of her drawing spread across the floor. 3 figures again. This time, the tall one had a heart drawn on his shirt, and next to it, scrawled in red crayon, We're together now. They stood in the doorway, watching the snow fall in soft silence. Mireille leaned her head on his shoulder. Cassiel kissed the top of her hair. She whispered, We'll move slow. He whispered back, I'll follow your pace. They didn't call it a second chance. They didn't call it anything at all. It simply was. Not perfect, not polished, but real. Sometimes the deepest wounds aren't caused by strangers, but by those we once trusted to hold our hearts gently. And sometimes healing isn't loud. It's quiet. It's in every small act done without being asked. True love isn't about a perfect beginning. It's about choosing someone again and again, even after the storm, especially after the storm. If this story moved you, hit that like and leave a comment about what forgiveness means to you. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful tales from Mr. Ross' Story Trail. There's someone out there who needs this story. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's someone you love. Pass it on. Some stories end with grand reunions. Others end in silence. But this one, it ends with a choice. The choice to return. The choice to forgive. The choice to rebuild, not for show, but for peace. Not every scar is visible. Some come from sentences said in calm tones. Words that lodge themselves in memory and echo in quiet moments. Cassiel once believed that control was strength, and in that belief, he used words to protect himself. At someone else's expense, but words have weight, and when spoken without care, they fracture more than just connection, they fracture belief. This story reminds us that it isn't just what we say. It's when we say it, how, and to whom, because healing begins where cruelty stops. And sometimes, an apology starts with silence and ends with presence. Love isn't proven by how long someone stays through chaos. It's shown by whether they respect your need for calm after the storm. Mireille didn't chase what broke her. She didn't beg for answers or demand closure. She chose peace, because that too is an act of love. The world often praises endurance in relationships, staying through pain, holding on no matter what. But what if love, real love, is not about holding on, but about knowing when to let go? Mireille didn't stop loving. She just started loving herself too. Cassiel could buy anything, except time, except warmth, except trust. And while he once believed power could protect a legacy, Esme reminded him that the only legacy that matters is how a child feels when they hear your name. She didn't need a mansion. She needed a bedtime story. She needed someone to kneel down, listen closely, and see her as more than a responsibility. Esme never asked him to be rich. She just needed him to be there. It's easy to say I'm sorry. Harder to show up, day after day, when no one is clapping and forgiveness isn't guaranteed. Cassiel didn't redeem himself by returning. He redeemed himself by remaining, by failing at pancakes and still showing up to try again, by raking leaves with cold hands and no camera watching, by reading to children who didn't care who he used to be, only who he was now. Redemption is earned in the smallest, most ordinary choices. It looks like effort, not speeches. There are those who call leaving quitting, but sometimes leaving is surviving. Mireille didn't run to punish. She left to preserve what was still whole inside her. And in doing so, she created a life for her child free from fear, free from shame, full of joy. She wasn't hiding, she was healing. We are allowed to step away from pain, especially when it wears the face of someone we once loved. Choosing peace isn't weak. It's wise. We all break something. A trust, a promise, a heart. But it's what we choose to build in the quiet afterward that tells the truth of who we are. Because after the storm, what matters most isn't what was broken, but what we choose to rebuild.